All right. So thank you, Nathaniel, for coming and joining me on my first podcast. I thought it would be appropriate to have you on the podcast for the first guest because you were the first podcast that I was on in your channel that I've on the sidelines been watching you grow over time. I first learned about your channel when I saw that you had covered the old copper stuff, and that's the research that I was involved in. So I was intrigued because I thought you did, a pretty good job summarizing everything and the issues that you'd been seeing online that I'd been sharing too with all the different ideas surrounding the ancient copper mining and use of copper around the Great Lakes and the stories and books that have been written over the years about that. So your channel is focused on particularly the Americas and Native American archaeology and sites. So when you started your channel, what was your original motivation? Why, and with the focus on Native American?
The whole thing was born of opportunity and annoyance and maybe a little patriotism or something. I was a big fan of like the Crash Course series and like Crash Course history and philosophy and stuff like that. And I loved what they were doing, making what are oftentimes very complicated or niche concepts really digestible. And I also was a huge fan at the time of Dr. Jackson Crawford's channel, where he's talking about linguistics and Indo-European stuff. And, he mostly focuses on Viking stuff, but it's more about like the language stuff that I was really interested in. And the way that he was able to do the whole thing from his phone, every shooting, editing, uploading, all of it was just from his phone. But at the same time, I was getting really annoyed at the fact that all archaeology content that you really were finding at the time, 2020, was old world. There was very, very little dealing with North America. And if you did get stuff from the Americas, it was always from the canon of cultures that matter, like the Maya, the Aztec, things like that. Even the Mississippians didn't really get a whole lot of attention. Who then, they're building monumental architecture and all this other stuff. And I was in grad school at the time. I was already up to my eyeballs in all of this literature about Indigenous North America and stuff. But before I decided to do anything myself, I emailed Crash Course and asked them if they had any plans to do a Crash Course archaeology. I was trying to see if anyone was already going to do it. And every email that I got back was like, yeah, we have absolutely no plans to do anything like that. And so I was on this excavation outside of Paris, Texas, called the Bodark project. And I was like, well, fuck it. If no one else is going to do it, I'll do it until someone else shows up and starts doing a better job than me, and then I'll quit. It never quite happened. Obviously, like Pete over at Ancient Americas is doing phenomenal work. I love his channel. But he does like all of North America, and it's very different in tone and style. And you've got Indigenous History Now. There's a channel called Archaeo-Viking that's good. My friend JT Lewis recently started a channel that's much more in line with what I'm doing. But it's just the fact that we don't really have a whole lot of people from within archaeology making content about this stuff. If no one else is going to do it, then screw it. So I started it then, and I thought I was going to get bored of it after, a few months, but it's continued much longer than I thought my attention span was going to allow for.
Yeah. And that brings up a good point. And I think we talked about this in other podcasts. It's science in general, in archaeology and geology, has a communication issue. And that is, when I teach my intro classes, I talk about the scientific method, and I always emphasize that the results in disseminating them, publishing them, communicating them is actually, I think, some of the hardest parts of the scientific method. Just getting the word out there and I mean, you can look at, I mean, the fact that there's even a debate in any way with the round earth shows how long it takes for paradigms to completely kind of seep in and change the way people look at the world. But yeah, there's a communication issue, and making content, I think, is one way to do that, especially from people that are actual real scientists, like, I mean, practicing archaeologists like you. And I want to get into that and the stuff you've been working on in your education and everything. But they need we need content. I guess the way I'm calling communication now going forward, content creation, to push their findings and results and implications to the public in a way that is palpable. And I think that I have been surprised by recent, in the last 5 to 10 years, the development of these long form podcast interviews with people. And the fact that, 5, 10 years ago, tell me if I'm wrong, everyone's saying, hey, everyone's attention span's going to shit. And I mean, I do think that's true to some extent, but then for whatever reason, this phenomenon of long form podcasts just grows out of this like cultural belief that our attention span's going to crap. So it shows that, first of all, if done right, interviews with long form podcasts with scientists and other people that have interesting ideas there's a demand for it. Number one.
Yeah, for sure.
Number two, it has to be done in a way that is not tacky, let me say maybe dorky, too dorky, too childish, maybe.
It's certainly childish. Yeah.
Yeah. And also not too Hollywoodish. And I'm talking Hollywood of the olden days. We want to be like kind of crisp, clean, modern communicators, but at the same time, getting at those questions and thinking and ideas that are interesting and stirring public, and we kind of are gathering from comments online. But what was really an inspiration for my channel is Andrew Huberman, number one, not because I'm into I do like nutrition, but his style, I couldn't believe, it shot up out of nowhere. And he literally is sitting there going over really intricate information. Have you watched any of his podcasts?
Not familiar, no.
Yeah, but he's a Stanford neuroscientist and studies the eye, but he just goes over research, and it's high quality, pretty in depth. It's even hard for me to follow. I'm in a PhD in a whole different field, but
yeah,
I think I get a lot of information out of it, but it just skyrocketed when it was published in viewership. And I was like, what? So this shows for sure that kind of information, if it's done well, I don't think there's as big of a market or demand for archaeology, especially North American archaeology, or especially North American geoarchaeology, what I do. But there is a substantial viewership and interest out there in the public, and I see on your channel, and I've just gathered. So
there's a snowball effect happening right now. In fact, earlier today, I did a live stream with Dr. Flint Dibble about zooarchaeology and some of my graduate work and things. And we're doing this thing this weekend called Real Archaeology. That's the hashtag and the website and everything is Real Archaeology. And basically, it's just a bunch of us archaeology communicators have been doing our own thing in isolation for a few years now, but now we're all doing stuff together. This weekend, all of us put out a piece of content and we're interreferencing each other to do a few things. One, it's kind of to train the algorithm that if you're watching 2 or 3 of us, there's 30, 40, 50 more channels with similar content. And really that's the thing. It's first no one was doing it, and then a couple of us were doing it, and we saw each other do it, so more people started doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's starting to grow and build and actually develop some momentum instead of all of us kind of operating in our own little worlds.
And so that brings up a point I wanted to get to later, but I'll, right now I'll bring it up, is how do you see your channel evolving in, let's say the next year, the next 5 years, and let's just stick at the next year to 5 years.
That's a phenomenal question, and I don't know, because basically my production schedule is, recently it's been kind of wonky, but typically I'm a field director. I run archaeological projects for a company based out of Texas. So I go to work. I work, Monday through Friday or whatever. And then on Saturday morning, I wake up and I'm like, do I have the energy to make a video today? And if I do, I'm like, okay, well, what the hell am I going to do it on? I've got kind of a list of things, but usually like some idea will start germinating that morning, and I'll start, looking for some sources and do some reading. And it's usually something that's tangentially related to something I'm already pretty familiar with, or is related to another video that I've done that I can like tie together. And I'll, research it, put it together, shoot it Saturday afternoon, edit it on Sunday, and upload it sometime that night or something like that. Sometimes I'll decide I don't feel like editing it and wait till next weekend to edit it and put it up.
Yeah.
So I have no idea where the channel is going, because I am making it up as I go along in such an immediate, rapid turnover rate that I honestly don't know how I don't make way more mistakes than I do. And people are willing to point out when I make like a really, really big mistake, and it doesn't happen very often. And usually it has to do with something that's tangential to what I'm actually talking about.
Yeah, it's like you can't know everything. It's like, and you can't research every single detail when you go out there and say some stuff. And it's like, oops, whoops, yep, I'm a person too.
Yeah.
And so how do you do your videos? You do Zoom? Because when we did it was Zoom. And how do you edit?
Yeah, I was doing, when I do interview videos, I do it with Zoom. When I do just like talking head straight to camera kind of stuff, I just record it on my phone, throw it into the computer. There's a freeware video editor called DaVinci Resolve that is far better than it has any business being as a free piece of software. Cut it together, drop in images, or I've been doing a thing a lot more recently where when I'm on excavation projects, I'll get just like stock footage of me, cleaning floors or cutting profiles or, whatever, just like throw in the background. So it's not just like my blank face talking for the entire video. That's something to look at. Just like, cut that together and it exports and goes up. It's the fact that I'm able to do everything from research, write, shoot, edit, and upload. It's a testament to the technology that we've got right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking that when I was kind of putting this together, because I was like, I have Zoom and I have iMovie, and they just kind of have them. iMovie came with it's the Mac version, and it's pretty nice. And then I was like, I'm just going to step up and just get a little bit nicer remote podcast software. And I did Riverside, and it's still pretty cheap for the whole year and has a couple of benefits because it helps you edit, and you can just get higher res every like video and audio. So I was like, yeah, for an investment, that's all I really put into starting a podcast, besides a couple like lights and just thinking.
What platform are you planning to release this through? Are you going to do it as like a podcast? Or are you going to put it on YouTube? Like, what's the plan for that?
I think YouTube channel, and then, and just put them on there for now. I'm going to follow up with show notes on a Substack with the video. So people they might be interested in watching the interview. It could be long, but they could read the show notes and kind of get an idea and kind of have that to go along with the podcast. And so, yeah, that's where I see it. And so kind of changing the subject, and I want to get to two things. One thing is not as important, but it's interest for me. So I see you're smoking a pipe.
Yeah.
Do you grow tobacco, or do you have any special place to get your tobacco? Because I bring this up because I have grown my own and cured my own tobacco.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And it's actually not that hard. It's just as easy as like growing tomatoes, but I will say they do they're susceptible to aphids, but the deer do not touch them, or
That
the
makes sense.
rabbits, because of the nicotine.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So they're actually great to border other plants with if you're trying to keep the deer and other things out of your garden.
That's cool. Okay, that's sharp. I need to remember that.
They're sticky leaves, dude. They're really
I know.
sticky.
I grew up in tobacco country. I'm very aware.
Oh, oh, okay, yeah. So I had never seen any of those things growing up, but
Yeah, I'm from Carolina. Like that's historically like I've surveyed so many tobacco fields that have been absolutely ruined by 150 years of tobacco cultivation, and then they'll stick like cattle on top of it, so the soil gets all compressed and it's just like concrete trying to dig through it.
yeah. So that also brings up the second thing is, so tell me a little bit about, I don't know much about you personally, but I really am interested in like kind of where are you from? How'd you get interested into archaeology? And then where'd you do your bachelor's and master's? And then from there got your first job.
Yeah, the biographical thing. So
Yeah.
I was born in northwestern South Carolina. We lived around Clemson University, which is a big engineering school. It's where my dad was at school at the time. And yeah, so we lived there for about 7 years, and then we moved up to Morristown, Tennessee, which is another like Appalachian Ridge and Valley town, not too far from Knoxville. And then we moved out to Greenville, North Carolina, and I was there for high school before I went to App State University, which getting me back where I belonged in Appalachia. And my dad was an engineer, and growing up, we always thought that I was going to be a lawyer. Like the plan from the age of like 8 was I was going to be like a prosecuting attorney or something like that.
Okay.
The
Why
the
is
whole
that?
my parents always observed this tendency to be very good at formulating arguments,
Hmm.
and making the case for whatever it might be. And in their head, that's lawyer.
Okay.
Take information, put it together into an argument, and put it forward. But when I was in high
Little did they
school,
know that's also a YouTuber now.
well, it's also a scientist.
True.
But what in high school, I was taking a biology class at the community college. I was able to get like concurrent credit for taking my classes at the college. So I was in this biology class, and my biology teacher said something to the effect of, "You're not a lawyer, you're a scientist. Like you will hate being a lawyer. Don't do it." And around the same time, I was talking to some attorneys. Fly got in my beer. Around the same time, I was talking to some attorneys. I'm like, "Oh wait, no, I don't want to do this. I will absolutely hate that. I got to find something else." And at the time, History Channel actually had like cool Egyptology and history documentaries and stuff. And I just remember seeing Zai Hawass on those documentaries, and
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying.
seeing like I remember having in words the thought that man loves his job and I want that. So then I got up to App State and started taking anthropology and archaeology classes, and I was like, "Yep, this is the thing."
What college? University?
Appalachian State. It's in Boone, North Carolina. It's like only a couple of miles from the Tennessee border.
So you did your undergrad and master's there? I know you did your master's there.
No, they don't have a master's program, which is the awesome thing about App State is that because they don't have a master's program, you don't have a bunch of grad students teaching the undergrad classes. Like you are getting direct oversight from the main faculty.
This is an advertisement for Appalachian State.
Appalachian. Same,
Appalachian, sorry.
It's named after the Appalachee. They're an indigenous group down in the panhandle of Florida. But when the Spanish first came over, they named like that part of the continent Appalachia. And then that got just kind of expanded to the entire Southeast for a long time, was the Appalachian region. And then it kind of got like recompressed to just the mountain ranges that constituted the eastern seaboard.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, cool. So you did your undergrad there, but I believe I saw you did a master's, right?
I did. I got that from Tennessee, Knoxville.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so right over the mountains, and it's where both of my my main professors in undergrad went. Tom White and Larry Kimball. Larry was a lithicist. He studies stone tools. And Tom did his master's in that also, but he, after doing his master's, stuck around and did a PhD in zooarchaeology, which is the study of animal remains from archaeological sites, and using those animal remains to understand human behavior and past cultures and things like that. But like foodways, sorry, beer's bubbly. Foodways, environmental reconstructions, those kinds of like processes that are happening. So it's not like paleontology where I don't study animals. I study people using the animal remains that show up on the sites. And that's what he did. And I didn't think that that was going to be my thing, but I knew that, okay, I'm at this university where this guy does this. I might as well like get this information from the best expert I have available, right? Like while I'm here, I might as well check it out. And that class kind of showed me the breadth of the kinds of things that I could do with zooarchaeology that's so much far beyond just looking at stone tools or pottery or these more conventional artifact oriented analyses. Doing those.
What do you mean by that? I think I have an idea, but
Yeah, so like
I'll
stone
let
tools,
you tell us.
stone tools are great. Stone tools, you can do all kinds of stuff. Look at like lithic reduction sequences and how people are conceptualizing their production process called chaîne abattoir. Or looking at, okay, we've got these tool types and these tool types imply these functions. So when you start seeing like adses show up, okay, they're doing woodworking now. We've actually got the material correlate for that activity. Awesome. But it's much more limited compared to, okay, I've got this giant assemblage of 20,000 animal bones. I can look at the ages at death of the deer and figure out what season these people were occupying this site. I can look at all the different species that they have hunted and butchered and killed and things, and look at what kind of diet they might be working with. I can look at the bone fragmentation patterns and figure out the kinds of, if they're only going after the meat, are they breaking open the bones to get marrow? Are they grinding those bones down and boiling them to get collagen and fat out of? And does that imply things about like dietary stress? Are they having to go to those extreme lengths to get enough food because there's a scarcity? Or is there something else going on? Are they using that fat for something else maybe? And comparing that to like the plant remains to maybe tease those kinds of things out. There's also some things that we can do called density mediated attrition. And the premise on that is like, so let's say you've got a tibia, right? Your shin bone. The part of the tibia that's down by the foot is a lot denser than the part that's up by the knee. So if you look at all of your tibia fragments and you've got a lot of the ones that are down by the foot and not a lot of the fragments that are up from the knee, that means that the less dense bone is probably degrading faster. So you can use that as a proxy to see, is there a bunch of stuff missing because soil acidity has destroyed them and it's just these really dense pieces that are surviving long. So I can understand some things about the totality of the zooarch assemblage to make inferences about how good of a resolution do we actually have based on what's left. the decompositional aspects of where the material was coming from. You can take these one zooarch assemblage and slice it so many different ways to address totally different issues. Foodways
So
versus environment.
where do you find these deposits of large amounts of bone fragments and fossils like this?
Well,
I know they're not true fossils,
yeah,
but
not fossils, but like
artifacts and bit.
Antiquated bone. Yeah. In the Southeast, the best place for them, we tend to get them in what are called sheltered sites. So things where we have like rock overhangs that are protected against rain, because rainwater is slightly acidic. And if that is getting into the soil and building up, you have soil acidity that is eating things out. So sheltered sites are great, but also anywhere that's got long-term repeated deposition. Like, let's say you've got like a short-term campsite and they kill and butcher some animal and they throw it out. That's going to get torn up pretty quick because you've got scavenging and like coyotes and other animals that are going to come scavenge it and it's going to be gone. But if you get regular repeated use of these places, it's like a safety and numbers thing, but for taphonomic processes, degradation processes. So they add up, and then the scavengers and the soil acidity can't get rid of all of them. So the net effect is that you just have a bigger, more robust assemblage altogether. You also, so these are places like in the river valleys, you get a lot of these freshwater mussel middens, and sometimes monumental sites, like full-blown mounds that are built out of mussel shell.
Yeah.
And there's tons of bone in those.
On the coast of like the Carolinas and Florida, you hear
not
about
just
these gigantic.
You do, but not just there. You get them on the Green River or on the Tennessee River and like all of these places in the west of the Appalachians where you get these really intensively constructed shell mounds that have great preservation. And then, of course, newer sites, things that are, 1,000 to 2,000 years old that just haven't had the time for the bones to decompose. That's also when people are living more village life than long-term residential base camp life. So you end up having more concentrated accumulation. So you get more from that. So it's representation is not even across landscapes or across time periods, but we do get it.
Yeah. And this brings up a pet peeve of mine, and I don't want to get too technical, but this is the radiocarbon density population curves through time, where they sum up the radiocarbon calibration distributions, and there's more dates from certain periods. They call them more populated. When you just said exactly why that's not a good thing, because material cultures aren't the same through time. And it's okay to do it. Yeah. Compare apples to apples, maybe, the last 2,000 years. But I've seen these human population inferences from radiocarbon distribution, some densities over the woodland to the archaic. And it's just, they're absolute. And then they're compared against paleo, pollen records, because they're looking for some kind of metric of humans, like a time series. And it's just like, first of all, we know sea levels have changed since the early Holocene along those coasts. We know the material cultures have changed. Like archaic peoples don't leave as much material stuff. They don't live in the same areas for the long time. All the things but it's used everywhere.
But archaic peoples create more sites than later peoples because they're not living in villages. So that counterbalances that fact. Most sites that I document at work are archaic in age. That's just most of the sites are archaic. They're small. They're not these perpetually occupied villages. So if you're looking at like those radiocarbon aggregates and you're looking at them trying to compare like early, middle, and late archaic, that's not an inappropriate comparison to make.
Through the archaic, middle,
if you're doing it early, middle, and late archaic, I think that's totally fine, knowing that this is a very big picture aggregate kind of
broad brush.
It's a very broad brush assessment where it's like, okay, the population was this, and now we get way more sites with way more dates. So it does seem that it goes up a little bit, and then, or goes up in this region and goes down in these these kinds of things. Trying to assign like anything approaching numbers to that is absurd. Trying to say it's like this number of people is ridiculous, but you can start to say, okay, we're seeing this ebb and flow of population densities, or at least site generation densities over
site generation densities, and that should be hopefully proportional to the amount of people. And I think I also kind of pick on that one because I think lake sediments, and we talked about the lead research, I think they're going to offer a window into looking at social changes through time via their pollution they emit. And
it's at least showing you changes in like industrial changes for sure.
Yeah, and metals are just one. There's now these fecal stanols that are linked to fecal matter, which there's been issues. I'm not going to split hairs and all those. I don't think there's going to be, a straightforward answer on those. Nitrogen isotopes.
Phosphorus is also DNA. A big one. Yeah.
Yeah, there's and I've seen some work, my work and other colleagues in the Ohio River Valley that have poured these oxbow lakes next to sites like Kincaid and Cahokia. Nitrogen isotopes track what the archaeological population curves look like. And nitrogen isotopes are way cheaper than fecal stanols and DNA. And we know higher nitrogen isotopes become enriched in these sites with higher population densities. That could be linked to enriched sewage and fertilizers and soil erosion, which is heavier nitrogen because people fractionate nitrogen when they eat. Yeah, so it makes sense that the nitrogen isotopes are like literally proportional to the shit coming into the lake. And that amount of shit is proportional to the amount of people living next to the lake. So yeah, I think those will help. I think those are promising routes to look at relative population changes through time.
At least to check, at least is a parallel but distinct.
Complementary.
Yeah. Certainly a complementary data set to be able to cross-check just the raw radiocarbon aggregate data for sure.
Yeah. And I want to get onto like some more fun or interesting subject, but I do want to say too, it was remarkable as a geologist. My background, for people that don't know, I have a PhD in geology, but I did geochemistry and I focused on kind of geoarchaeological questions. So, but when I use lake sediments, so I use data sets that are independent of the archaeological record. And I like to talk about that in my dissertation, everything, and how it's like a new window. But the funny thing is, I went up there as a grad student and I studied in the Copper Ranges and near Cahokia. When I got my data back, it was surprising how well it matched up with the archaeological record both times. And it was like magic because I analyzed the sediment core at Cahokia and there's this anomaly of heavy metals and nitrogen, and I get the radiocarbon dates back that layers dated to the Stirling phase. I'm like, this cannot be real. I was like, that's the Stirling phase is the big high phase at Cahokia between 11 and 1200 CE.
Yep.
And I was
it's almost like we knew what we were talking about.
Yeah, I was like, so if you wanted an independent person, just come out, like send in the inspector to do an inspection. I was about as close as they could get to inspecting what Cahokia, what was the archaeological 100 years of work there has done. And it was spot on. Other people have cored Horseshoe Lake and with this flood idea, and I totally disagree with, and I've written about it. And they've interpreted that same layer, which is heavy metals and enriched nitrogen isotopes, as this mega flood. You may have seen these press releases. And a mega flood at the time, Cahokia is at its population apex in the archaeological record. And then I also up in the Keweenaw with the copper cultures, I get the spikes and lead back. They match Willard Libby's original dates from Robert Ritzenthaler in the from his excavations at that site in Old Copper. I mean, that alone was like one of the reasons I wrote that book, Great Water. I was like, this is for you, Libby and Ritzenthaler. because even after all this time, and they gave him all kinds of crap, they're like, there's no way that date's 5,400 years old. Metal use by Native Americans and is not that old. And it stood the test of time, even with his really kind of primitive way of measuring, the Geiger counter kind of way. And so, this kind of brings us back to the beginning part of your channel and focusing on Native American, North American accomplishments, covering, communicating the findings in America. And so you've been doing this now professionally for how many years again?
12.
12 years professionally. So
Yep.
everyone at home wants to know, what is the coolest thing you ever found?
Paycheck. The fact that,
or maybe top 2 or 3 things if you can't decide.
I mean,
paycheck. Oh yeah, that's a good
one. The coolest thing is that I found a career where I get to go play in the woods with my friends and act like degenerates all day, and then come home and act like degenerates with my friends at night. Like, that's the coolest thing. But
wow, so you found an interesting life in career.
Yeah.
So where are you right now, by the way?
I am,
or if you don't mind, the state at least.
I'm like 2 hours south of St. Louis in Missouri right now.
Are you working? You're out in the field. Okay.
Yeah. I'm
cool.
I'm a field director, so I'm running a survey project on some Army Corps shit.
Okay. And so, okay, going back then, besides, okay, you found a cool life, you found something you're doing, you can debauchery and having fun in the woods all day. But materially, what is the coolest thing you found in an archaeological excavation? Yeah.
So
during your career.
There was a site that we excavated in Alabama about 10 years ago. I actually just put up a video about this today. That I've been going through all of the different aspects of the site. So the first video is on the lithics, and the second video is on the ceramics, and this video is on the animal bones. And the amount of information that we were able to pull from these fragmented, uninteresting on their own merit animal bones in aggregate, when you put them together and look at the way that people's like food oriented behaviors are changing, and that tied in with settlement patterns changing. And it really looks like there is some kind of danger coming from the Tennessee River itself. They've moved off the Tennessee and they've gone up on this like creek. And none of the species that we're seeing are coming from the river itself. They're all like no riverine fishes. The mussels are typically smaller species. So it looks like they're scared to death of that river. And seeing that data laid out was fascinating, because around the same time in Mississippi, there's another culture called the Miller that are getting bigger. The sites are getting bigger. They're expanding. And my pet hypothesis on this, and this isn't like published anywhere or anything, my boss on that project, Ben Hoxbergen, is one of the people who came up with this idea. But are we maybe looking at some kind of like interregional conflict going on? And can we actually see that in the animal bones that we're finding from this site? I think that's the coolest thing that I've seen. And again, that hypothesis has not been established in the literature in such a way that I'm willing to say that we're right about that. But it's a really cool possibility that might eventually come from that work we did 10 years ago.
So is there like faunal bone analysis remains for like maybe scavenging upland critters to like survive up there, like, porcupine or something that they normally
They're eating snails.
Eating snails.
They're eating snails.
So scavenging snails, maybe.
There are
hiding up in the Creek Valley.
Yeah, there are these entire pit features where thousands of freshwater snail shells. So we're not, obviously this village is not in a creek.
Yeah.
They had to have been taken out of the water and then dumped in these pits, and they're all about the same size. They're all about the same age. So they're actively utilizing snails as a food resource.
Interesting.
Which, in terms of like
Yeah.
labor versus caloric and like nutritional return, that's way down there. That's like a third order food resource. So if they're going after that, but they won't go to the Tennessee River to get big fish and big mussels, something weird's going on there.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And bringing up
It's weird.
these freshwater environments, when I was doing my research down in Mississippi River floodplain at Horseshoe Lake by Cahokia, I was getting in the literature a little bit about freshwater bivalves along the Ohio River.
Did you read the Cheryl Clausen Feasting with Shellfish book?
No,
Okay.
I didn't get into it too deep, but it was like more of this, one of those light bulbs went off, and it was like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe one day I'll try to get into this more, because I'd noticed a pattern in the sediment cores from Horseshoe Lake next to Cahokia, that below that disturbance layer full of metals and nitrogen isotopes enriched, there's all these like little clamshells, bivalves, and what have you. I don't even know all this. Maybe some snails.
Those
And then there's a disturbance layer, and then all those shells above that in the sediments after Cahokia up to modern, gone, or maybe a very small amount. So that suggests that the disturbance of Cahokia affected the freshwater environments of the lakes, to me.
it could for sure.
And so there's this paper by Peacock. That's all I can remember without digging. Maybe if I can pull up images for this interview, which I think I'm going to be able to, I'll pull up papers and just stick them in the front. I think it's this paper by Peacock where they do mention that there's this decline in freshwater bivalves in these oxbow lakes, and it's corresponding with the rise in maize agriculture as it comes up the Mississippi River.
Interesting. Okay.
And I was like, I think you can see that. And my friend that works in China sees the same kind of thing, where there's all these shells in these lakes, like all kinds of calcareous snails. And I'm not a biologist. Then you see like the dynasties start to show up, and big dynasties in China grow and put all this rice and metallurgy around these lakes. Then all these freshwater species, at least their shells, are absent after that.
Interesting.
Yeah. And this is all like 1,000 years ago. So, I mean, we're ongoing in our anthropogenic modification of the environment, which is another side interest of mine, is studying that. But I don't want to get too far into that right now. But I do think we can measure the impact of humans in North America, by the way,
For sure.
for thousands of years, using lead and other nitrogen isotopes, and both at Mississippian sites and archaic sites. So I think that's one thing that's been overlooked for a while. And so, yeah, what I tried to give to you was, you want to focus on North American archaeology because you have been working there. You've seen some cool stuff. But why do you think it's been overlooked? Native American, like even my research, I've, doing this lead reconstruction stuff in Michigan next to these copper ranges that are known for 100 years, but no one used a known method, lake coring, to do it next to these things. So why, in your mind, have Native Americans been overlooked, even by historically, archaeologically interested people?
Great question. Give me 1 second. I'll be right back, and I will answer it. You can cut around this.
Yeah, I will. No problem.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah. Why has North American archaeology been kind of ignored?
Yeah.
I don't think it always has been, but because of the nature of media, history education, there's a few things going on. One, people are distracted by shiny bullshit. And by shiny bullshit, I mean big, dumb, obvious stuff. Big pyramids made out of rocks.
Yeah.
Gold and silver and myrrh. These kinds of like things that we have been conditioned to see as the hallmarks of cultures that matter. And Native American archaeology has very different. The achievements of these people are not the same as the achievements of people in Europe and Asia. North Americans are building environments. They are constructing forests with selected tree taxa. They are not manicuring, but they're actively perpetuating high. It is one of the best developed landscape management forestry regimes in the history of the world that they developed. And that's really hard to see after a bunch of Europeans show up and bulldoze the whole thing and put cornfields all over it.
Blight, chestnut tree blight.
Chestnut
and the
blights
diseases.
and all the rest of it. One of the other things that has happened is, okay, you take any grade school history book and you open it up and there's like a chapter about America before. And then it's 1492. And then it's because the history curriculum wants you to know the history of the nation of the United States. If we wanted to do a history of the continent of North America, all of that shit that happened after, written records showed up would constitute maybe a third of the material. And no history class, in terms of basic elementary education, can tolerate making the narrative of the nation a third of the narrative of the whole class. And I don't think in my entire elementary, middle school, or high school education we ever got. Sometimes we made it to World War II and a little bit into it, but we never got past that. We never got to the civil rights movement. The semester always ran out before we got there. So, like, in terms of the canon of important things you need to know, anything pre-colonial is a footnote. It's not central to the narrative. And because of that, when you do hear in passing about, Cahokia, Pinson Mounds, Etowah, Okmulgee, any of these places, you've never heard it before, and so it doesn't stick. Whereas when you hear a reference to the Liberty Bell in some TV show, you know what that is, it sticks. But it's the lack of constant, repeated exposure. You can't just, like, I'm sure that I heard about Cahokia at some point between the ages of 5 and 20 or whatever, but it never stuck because I heard about it once. You need these ideas to be introduced and reinforced, and that just doesn't happen. Whereas you go to the movies, you see Gladiator, you see the Colosseum, you watch, The Mummy, you see the pyramids. Like, these kinds of things are in the cultural zeitgeist because they're getting beaten into us through fiction and through public education all the time. Every other year you take world civilizations, you hear about the cultures that matter. You don't hear about the Mississippians.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's also a language issue. I think even with well-intended people who seem to describe the history of Native Americans in more of this wishy-washy, spiritual kind of manner rather than as
Druid hippies.
As a matter of fact type deal. And there's always an emphasis on the cultural interchange between when Europeans show up after Columbus and Native Americans in the stories and the battles between the Sioux and the Comanche and the Texas Rangers. There's just really that emphasis on that part. And if there's anything that someone knows about, it's that and the Pilgrims and, how they survived with the help of the Native Americans and maybe Lewis and Clark. That's actually one that really should be the stories, not Lewis and Clark themselves, but what they had seen in their journal diaries is worth going into for whoever's watching this, because that is does kind of give you a little bit of a window into what's called like the Mandan tribes
Mm-hmm.
and villages on like the Missouri River, and making it past the Cascades and seeing this totally distinct language group on the other side of the Cascades that they
Yeah.
noticed. And they're like, all these groups before that were this language group that's probably like, I'm not an expert enough to go into more onto
Yeah.
those, to speculate too far into that. So the language issue. This sort of I wanted to get to then is when you get to Cahokia, and even people that I know that went there with me, they'll go archaeological mound site, mounds by the highway, and sacrificial is another thing that usually comes with sacrificial mounds or mounds, and they just refuse to say that it's a city. It's a city. It's a biggest. And what I'm saying is I know the cities of Native Americans were different, but the closest equivalent in modern American language, you can maybe say a town or
No, for Cahokia,
settlement, but
it's a city. That one's a city.
And people just won't say it. Scientists, college people, like they'll go there, and it's because all the wooden structures are gone. All the wattle and daub is gone. There's only a section of the palisade wall there.
No,
Well, like this.
we talk about it being a city a lot. It's
Yeah,
one of the
archaeologists do, but even
yeah.
I'm talking, I guess, people that are not specialists at Cahokia. I'm not
Sure.
saying them and the people that work there. I'm saying
Certainly for like the
scientifically minded
signage
people.
and yeah, certainly for
Yeah.
like the signage and things like that, the way that it gets articulated, because they're trying to draw attention to the spectacle, not the prosaic. And
Yeah.
the city part is the prosaic part. That's the day-to-day life where people lived part. And they're again trying to shoehorn Indigenous America into the model of Europe and Asia. They're trying to make the unfamiliar familiar by comparing it to Europe and Asia,
Yeah.
rather than articulating it on its own terms. And
I see.
understandably so. It's really hard to get a casually interested public who think about this under a totally different paradigm than what they know about.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because the way I'm looking at it is an accessibility thing for someone that is, I'm thinking high school, college age people that are scientifically interested and inclined. I know there's going to be people that are never going to care or want to know. And because what you're saying, I think brings up this one that's really perplexing, which I wouldn't call a city, but is strangely, if you're just walking through, you might think it's the same as Poverty Point, which is an archaic mound site in Louisiana, which I've been to as well. And they're massive mounds there, massive site, like half concentric circle mounds, just crazy big, but there's no evidence for agriculture or really, as far as I remember, not any permanent settlement really. And they think the mounds were maybe
there is
religious.
There's some semblance of a local resident population, but it's nowhere near its capacity. That's a ceremonial site. Those are ceremonial grounds.
So that would be an example of, you can't go in there and be like, that's a town, that's a settlement, that's a city, just to make it easier or fit the mold of Europe and Asia across the Native Americans. But
if you talk
Cahokia,
if you talk to Indigenous people, like they know what a ceremonial ground is. It's part of their like living cultural practice. So if you point at Cahokia and are like, that is a ceremonial ground that people came to from across the Southeast, bringing their, craft materials with them, that makes sense to them. They know what that is. They have that today. They have, like sometimes they're called the powwows and things like that. They have this. You can articulate that to them. We don't have any functional equivalent to a ceremonial ground.
So you're thinking, and I think your thinking is right, that Cahokia was related to some sort of religious ceremonial.
I'm talking about Poverty Point.
Chunky.
I'm talking about Poverty Point. Yeah. Because, like I
okay.
said, there's not a huge resident population. There's a huge resident population at Cahokia. There's not a huge resident population at Poverty Point.
Yeah. So basically to conceive of the reasons to be and make Poverty Point and shoe it into our understanding of the world, I think is a lot more difficult than gathering to just, calling Cahokia a city.
Yeah. No, Poverty
Rather
Point.
than, it was probably more complicated than just being a city, Cahokia, because it was appears to be a religious center too, and cultural center.
Poverty Point is one of those sites that is so exciting to archaeologists because it violates so many of our received expectations about how social groups operate. I've got an interview on my channel with Dr. Seth Grooms where we really dig into Poverty Point as a archaeological concept and some of the social structures that are implied by the building of that thing, and like why they built it and when different aspects of it were built and to what end, what was the motivating force behind it, that I recommend going back and checking out, because he's dedicated his entire academic career up till pretty much this point to the Poverty Point cultural phenomenon, because there are other sites like it. He worked at a site called Jaketown that is a proto-Poverty Point. It has a lot of the structural aspects of Poverty Point, but it got flooded. It flooded and was abandoned. And no one site has all the attributes of Poverty Point. That's what makes Poverty Point like the be-all, end-all of Poverty Point culture. But a lot of sites down in that lower Mississippi Valley have 3, 4, 5 aspects of Poverty Point, and they anticipate it, and then they taper off from it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, in addition to Poverty Point, the oldest monumental architecture in the Americas, North America, is in Louisiana, and it's an earthen mound known as Watson Break. Am I correct? Is there an older one now?
I don't think there's a few of them where, like, when once you get back that far, the radiocarbon age ranges, because they start to overlap a little bit, and it's hard to see, like, is this one first, is that one first? But
the calibration, like, there's a plateau in the calibration curve.
Yeah, also just like the plus or minus the uncertainty range.
Yeah.
Gets big enough that it's hard to say specifically which one's first. But yeah, certainly the oldest monumental structures in North America to date are as old as or of approximately the same age as Watson Break. And Watson Break is probably it's the easiest one for us to wrap our heads around. It's this series of mounds that are built in kind of an elliptical pattern, and some of them are bigger than others, and they're proposed astronomical alignments to it. Others are just isolated mounds, not mound complexes. So it's hard to say specifically which one is like the first, or if Watson Break was the first one and it was added on to later and wound up becoming the biggest, or what the situation is with that. But Watson Break is in the ballpark of probably 6,000 years at the oldest, and that's older than the Olmec. We are talking about the origin of monumentality in North America. It's in Louisiana. That's the oldest monumentality that we know of.
And that's what I've heard as well. It's a remarkable, overlooked history. Here's just an example. You and I have just showed that. Look at right here. Is like what's going on in North America is a lot older than we even our nearby neighbors, Central America and South America. Yet even they still get more clout. I feel like,
and there's something else
going on in Louisiana.
I forget what the culture is, but there's another culture in South America that's about contemporaneous with Watson Break.
There's that old one in Peru with the cotton. Yeah, that's like early Holocene, which that whole story blew my mind when I learned about it. For those that don't know, it's like the domestication of cotton happened in South America, was domesticating a plant for a fiber, not a food. And I think you and I mentioned this. The gourd was also for water.
Yeah, it was
Domesticating
for
the gourd.
container technology of some kind. Yeah, the bottle gourd.
So for what I remember reading, the domestication of cotton was for fish nets, and they grew it in the highlands and then traded the cotton to the coastal sites where they made fish nets, and then they traded the fish for the cotton. And this
That's
is like
cool.
early Holocene. And talk about what an interesting, like, a technology for fish, number one. You're
That's nowhere
domesticating
near the
something for
fish.
fiber. That's nowhere near the fish. There's coordination between environments where the cotton grows well and the fish environment. And then there's all this monumental architecture up there that's dated to like the early Holocene. It's like crazy, crazy. That's cool stuff.
But like Mesoamerica and like Peru get the archaeological cloud because again, people get distracted by the shiny bullshit. And once a culture starts building architecture out of rock instead of coordinated soil deposits,
yeah,
they get the press.
Yeah. So and so just imagine, here's a thought experiment to kind of, illustrate the reactions I see people having towards Native American accomplishments. Where if you went to Cahokia and you brought someone there and you said, this is a city and there was thousands of people here and socially hierarchical, socially complex society, and then left, and then you took them to some ruins of like blocks, like let's say Machu Picchu. And I know that's where like the royalty lived. It wasn't necessarily like a city like Cahokia, but I feel like someone would come back and they would report Cahokia. They would call them mounds, and then they would call Machu Picchu ruins. And I think that alone, like that just small thing right there, shows that like it's the Europe, like our mind sees stone and buildings as much more important like things of the past.
Yeah,
when
for
you
sure.
see a mound of dirt with grass on it, you're just like, it's just a mound. Maybe I can see the priest lives on the mound, but it's not a ruin. It's
Right.
not a city like a pyramid, which is like, is even, it sounds better.
Yeah, like
it's
Rock's privilege. It is all it is. It's Rock's privilege.
Yeah, Rock's privilege. I like it.
Yeah.
And I came upon this stuff with the copper stuff when we got these signals from the lake sediment cores. They looked exactly like the signals you would get in lakes near Roman
in Greek.
in Spain, in Greek mines. And Flint actually covered some of this stuff, except he did Flint Dibble did the ice core. I saw he brought that up on Joe Rogan, and that tracks European pollution. But that's a whole different, there's sediments in Europe. The origins of extractive metallurgy, there's just a paper came out by Jack Longman, shows that the earliest lead signals in lakes comes from Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe. And
cool.
The lake sediments migrate the signals across Western Europe. It's freaking wild.
What are the dates they're getting for that?
Early Holocene. It's like 5,000-6,000 years ago, if I remember right. It's still, Michigan's kind of still
way older.
Yeah. But it never gets to smelting. By like the mid Holocene, it's like full on smelting. I think by 5,000 or 6,000 years ago in Europe, if I remember right. And before that, they were just messing around with annealing, just like they were in North America. Do you want to also, this is what I was trying to remember earlier. Do you want to hear something crazy? And I'm not saying there's any connection here, but I don't know what to think about this. The dates from Watson Break you're saying are 6,000 years ago?
Yeah.
That's when, I'm not saying there's any connection here. The lead signals are across more lakes at 6,000 years ago in the Michigan district. So there's intensive metallurgy happening around the Great Lakes, monumental architecture happening in Louisiana. There's no evidence for copper at Watson Break, and I don't think there's evidence at Poverty Point for some copper, but I think Watson Break's all local material.
Yeah,
but
Poverty
that just
Point
shows there's flickerings of something going on.
Yeah, Poverty get Great Lakes copper. It's coming from Minnesota, actually. At Poverty Point, but yeah, I don't think there's any evidence of copper at Watson Break.
But
But
it's
yeah,
interesting to say, yeah,
there's a
that's two
fluorescence.
markers right there. That if you kind of like markers of civilization are monumental architecture, metallurgy, writing, that you might not have been happening, but we have there's two major accomplishments by 6,000 years ago going on in North America when you're not seeing that other places. There's no evidence for that kind of stuff in South America, metallurgy and monumental architecture that I've seen in lake sediments. It just shows again, here we go. If we're talking about the old world being Europe, the old stuff is happening in the new world. So what the heck's going on? Like it's weird. And now with these new dates, the 23,000-year-old footprints, which I saw you covered on your channel, and there was some debate on those dates, and then they revised them and came back, and it turns out they were still 20,000 years old. Someone published a counter paper to that, and I was actually a faculty at the old department I worked at. Did you cover that?
Yeah. I was already pretty confident that the first set of dates were correct because they were in the correct sequence. They were in the right order. And if you've got old water contamination, like reservoir effect stuff happening to those grasses, they should be all over the place. They shouldn't be in an ordered sequence going down.
Yeah.
And they also shouldn't be like reservoir effects throws things off by a few hundred years, not thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah. Well, if you can get hard water effects in big lakes that are maybe 1,000 years, like
you can, but
but
these are grasses that are not aquatic grasses. They are wetland grasses, so they are not metabolizing exclusively water for photosynthesis. They're getting most of their photosynthetic carbon from the air.
Yep. And that's critical for making sure they're in equilibrium with the radiocarbon cycle and not having that dead effect.
Yeah, the old carbon effect.
That's why I saw, they came back and said, and I looked, again, I just did a quick read through because I'm just interested in this stuff on the side. And I kind of want to interview them for this podcast, talk about those footprints because, man, 23,000, if I'm right, it's not 20,000, it's 23,000 years ago.
20 to 23 is a good, safe, no one's going to come after you for saying that that's the range that they gave. I tend to center it around 22 just for convenience sake, but yeah.
That's wild because, I mean, right off the bat, what does that say? That this ice-free corridor, I mean, that's already been kind of thrown out, but
we've known that.
Opening,
those of us who were paying attention have known that was bogus for 20.
Well, I'm sure that a lot of people did migrate through the ice-free corridor, but I don't think it was the earliest.
Just not the first. It's just unless
not the first.
Unless they came through the ice-free corridor before it closed in the first place, but I don't know when that was. And I'm not a paleo specialist, so it's not something that I'm gonna go like digging for. I know some paleo specialists. I can probably ask them help.
And I saw the paper in Nature, I think, with this so-called 120,000-year-old evidence for fracturing rocks in California. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I know Ceremonial Macedon.
Yeah.
So one of the things that, as a zooarchaeologist, one of our main things is looking at bone fragmentation patterns, like comparing what deliberately fractured bone for within bone nutrients like marrow and collagen and things, what that looks like versus naturally broken bone tissue. I haven't seen the bones in person, so huge qualifier there, but they don't look like deliberate perimortem fracture to me at all. And I talked about this with Flint a few days ago, and he doesn't think they look like deliberately open bone either. And he's also a zooarchaeologist who deals with much bigger animals than I'm accustomed to dealing with. They keep making this claim that these are deliberately fractured bones for marrow or whatever. And we do not concur with that assessment.
That's speculation, I think, because that same thing, I looked through the paper and I was like, this is not good enough. You have to have solid, not just, I think these are fragments based on this and that. And I don't think that's a reliable.
Now, the valid question is, okay, let us say that these are not anthropogenic fragmentation. Why is this big ass rock with battering marks on it sitting right next to them in a low energy environment, and there's no other cobbles just like kicking around? I mean, it's a reasonable question. Why is here if it wasn't placed there? Because there's nothing else in the environment, according to the report that I've looked at. There's nothing really in the environment that would put it there, as far as I understand. So there is something to it, but if it's legitimate, there will be more. There will be other sites that get found that support it. It's the same thing that happened with pre-Clovis. You've got all of these sites that they report pre-Clovis dates, but the evidence is not really strong enough. And then you get Meadowcroft, and then you start to get other sites like Mesa Verde down in South America, and you get Cactus Hill in Virginia, and Page Ladson and Paisley Caves, and all of these pre-Clovis sites. And like, okay, now we've got a data set that we can really work with. In one or two of them, you might say, well, that's probably not, there's something intrusive. But for every single one of those sites to not be legitimate is statistically ridiculous.
And I mean, talk about the Meadowcroft rock shelter. Those dates were controversial for a while. And I'm not saying they aren't, but hey, he said it was, what's his name?
Adabasio.
Yeah, Adabasio. Like, there's pre-Clovis here. They're like, no, there's the dead carbon effect from coal. I've been to the rock shelter, and I knew about this coal idea. And I looked just to see, like, is there an outcrop of coal in the site? I mean, I didn't see anything. I mean, there's coal in the area. It's Western Pennsylvania, but it's like a sandstone cave, maybe. Yeah. So anyway, I was like, and
if
I remember
it's coal contamination, it should be coming back so much older.
Again, like what you said, there is this like consecutive, they're in chronological order, but
yeah,
they're going back. I think the dates were as old as like 18, the old ones. And I think even Adavasio was like,
not even sure about those, but the ones in
like, it was like 14 or 15. He was like, yeah, these are solid. These are good dates. And it was like, whoa. And people were like, no. And that was especially when Clovis was the old thing.
Yeah.
And so, or it was the, be all end all. So he weathered the storm through a lot of that stuff. And I think these footprints clearly don't.
No. There's nothing
everything
of ambiguity. And the thing with the footprints is that we expected to see something like that show up at some point. Like the dates
at 20,000.
Yeah. The dates that we were seeing, like you're getting older dates at Mesa Verde in South America. Like the commonly reported ones are like the 4,000s, but you're also getting
some of those really old ones.
You're also getting like 16,000s, and then you've got dates from Cactus Hill that are in the thousands, and that's on the East Coast. So it's like, no, there's older shit out west somewhere that we just aren't seeing yet.
See, I wasn't aware of all that, because I was like, if anything, I would have been like, maybe 18, 20,000 year old footprints, like on the West Coast, like in an old volcanic, like ash deposit, but like in the New Mexico, like in the middle part of North America in the desert. I guess I know it was clearly wetter. They were in a mud puddle when they were walking, but.
And also, I am.
That's crazy.
I am just young enough that I have never known an archaeological era where Clovis first was really taken seriously, like within the discipline, right? Like I'm in undergrad, and all of my professors are like, yeah, Clovis first is bullshit. It's obviously bullshit. Yeah. So like from my introduction to the discipline, no one around me thought that Clovis first made any fucking sense.
Yeah. I think.
Now, there are still people that are Clovis firsters, but
really,
there are still people that exist. And like, I don't know if this is still the case after White Sands, but I know that like one of my friends went to a guest lecture where someone was coming from like Wyoming or some shit, and he was still adamantly Clovis first. And this was in the last 5 years. Like, you go out west, you find way more Clovis firsters than you do in the southeast. Why that is, don't know, but we're all kind of operating in our own little worlds. Like, southeastern archaeologists don't really know what southwestern archaeologists and northwestern archaeologists are doing. We don't talk to each other that much. And so we are very different communities with our own sets of expectations. Like, the ideas that float around in southeastern archaeology are very different than the ideas that float around in southwestern archaeology or northwestern archaeology. They're different research communities in a lot of cases.
Also, getting not only is settlement really early on or early in North America, I think, and I saw an interesting study where they found a bit of an obsidian flake near the Great Lakes and dated it 2,000 years ago. Did you see this? And this obsidian flake geochemically comes from like Yellowstone.
Okay. Were they doing?
And I know which is a popular area of obsidian, but that traveled trading that obsidian that long ago.
It's on a river.
Yeah, it's true.
you just take the Missouri River, boom, done. That's the more believable thing, is for obsidian to be coming to the Great Lakes from somewhere out there rather than, like, say, the Yucatan or something like that, or like New Mexico. Because
that makes sense. Yeah,
you've got the Missouri River, that it's the least cost pathway to go from, Montana or whatever because once you get on the Missouri River, that takes you into the Mississippi, and then you can just go up the Ohio.
But then again, Watson Break, though, is like kind of in those, it's not on the Mississippi, but it's connected by waterways, and it's totally local.
It is.
And this is like a 1,000-year-old obsidian flake. I know it makes sense, but like, to me, I guess what I'm saying is we have dates from feet 23,000 years ago in White Sands, and we're having continental scale trade at least by 9,000 years ago. I mean, we're missing a lot of the story.
People are moving. They have always
people are moving.
They've always been moving. The thing that I will say is the obsidian that they found at Poverty Point, that's been tied to somewhere up in the Northwest. I forget if it was like Idaho or what. I think that once you get down into Louisiana, coming up the Gulf of Mexico, coming up from bringing obsidian from there makes so much more sense than coming in from Idaho or Montana or whatever. But I don't think that obsidian has actually been chemically sourced. And I've even heard some people say, like, it might not be obsidian. That might be Knox flint, because Knox is really black and glossy. And if you don't know what you're looking at and you're not super familiar, you might mistake it for obsidian. Like, it would be ridiculous to think of that happening now, like in 2024, for someone to make that mistake. But, 40, 50 years ago, someone might.
Interesting. So when you're studying archaeology, how do you see your findings? How do you see them being incorporated into modern society? Like, you're building this YouTube channel, you're conveying your information. What do you want to see in like society, or how do you want modern society to incorporate your findings into day-to-day life?
That's an interesting question, because it's something that I don't think about at all. I don't do archaeology to affect change in the modern day. I do it because I think it's fun and cool and relevant. Like, I think this place and these people mattered. But just because that is not my motivation for doing what I do does not mean that I am not acutely aware of the responsibility I have to make sure that the work that I do doesn't cause harm to people, right? It's important to be responsible with the work that I do. So like all archaeology is political. It is inherently political because anything we publish can and will be used by people to make certain land claims or certain, you know, when
Or it could interfere with building. It can interfere with property values. I mean,
yeah, and
depending on what you find, there's a lot of implications.
there's also the issues of like what an anthropologist named Trio called silence and erasure. The fact that like I talked about with the history books, the American history book, having one chapter dedicated to before 1492 and everything that happened before has been structurally silenced and erased from public consciousness. And that is a problem that has real world modern day ramifications or consequences for that. You have people going around largely online, but also in print, claiming that the people who built these mounds were not Native Americans. They were some other lost race that was exterminated and put to the sword by the people we call Native Americans. And that kind of erasure of, indigenous heritage from the public consciousness has very real, harmful, like political consequences. So undoing those silences and erasures is important, but it's not my primary motivator. It's just something that I know that I need to do as a responsible scientist.
Okay, so I like this because I love science for the sake of science just because I'm interested, and that's a good enough reason for it to come into being and for me to produce it is solely because I think it's interesting and I think other people should know about it.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about this all the fucking time. Like, we don't know the value of the research that we do when we're doing it. The people who came up with like the CT scan did not know that it was going to have medical applications that were going to save lives. They were doing it to figure out things about physics. So we don't know the consequences of the work that we do, but we do have to responsibly think about the kinds of questions we're asking, how we are asking them, and how we expose those results to, to the world. And it's part of why Indigenous scientific collaboration is becoming a much bigger ethical mandate for the discipline. Like, it's no longer a thing that maybe we should think about doing at some point. It's more and more becoming something that we are required to do as ethical archaeology, like as part of the ethical framework of how to do archaeology. The same way that psychiatrists have guardrails on what kinds of experiments they're allowed to do on patients, we are developing guardrails on what we're allowed to do that might have impacts, positive or negative, on descendant communities. And that's part of why the two Indigenous communities and archaeological communities we are putting in structures in place to force ourselves to actually work with them instead of working around them, to get us to stop talking over them and make sure that there's approaching more structural parity in who's framing the conversation, who's asking the questions. But there's a research project going on up in Alaska when I was up there that I heard about, where they're really interested in doing DNA research, but not on humans. They want to do DNA research on the salmon that they've been subsisting on, and using that genetic information from archaeological sites to look at the kinds of, like, the species of fishes and things that they were most intensively utilizing, and look at how that's changing over time. Like, these Indigenous communities have their own research questions that are every bit as valid, if not more valid, than the ones that we're coming up with. And when we try to operationalize our tools, our scientific toolkit, to help them answer those kinds of questions, Now what we do is giving back to that community. It's not extractive. We're not taking that information from these
Mm-hmm.
archaeological sites and building careers for ourselves out of it. We're helping our neighbors answer
Mm-hmm.
questions that they want to have answered, which is also an important shift in how we are doing what we're doing in the, you know,
It's important, yeah, to consider um, the indigenous perspective, especially, yeah, with their story and um, um, and not, I guess, not trying
it's
to
not
tell it for them.
it's not just perspective, it's knowledge. Like they have really useful, valuable knowledge about this stuff. Some of the best, most interesting, most exciting archaeological conversations I ever have are when I am in Oklahoma or at a conference, and my friend Kylan, who's with the Osage Nation, and he's a TIPO office employee, when we get to sit down and drink and just like talk about archaeological stuff. And I get information from him that I could never get from anyone else.
That's interesting, and we definitely need to utilize those people to learn. As far as I agree. Having someone that has a whole new perspective into the sphere to bring their unique view is only going to help to have that.
A lot of times they know what questions to ask. Like I could sit around and like cognitively masturbate over different like stone tool manufacturing techniques all day long. But at the end of the day, that's really only interesting to me and the 14 people I know that actually care about how rocks break differently when you hit them different. They've got much more substantial, socially and historically interesting questions to be asked that a lot of times we get so caught in our, bubble of what's already been done and how we can elaborate on it. There's a whole other track that we could be following, and we haven't been for the last 100 years of the discipline because no one really cared what they had to say.
I mean, you'd even say that in terms of like we're talking like thousands of years ago, like Clovis times, and I definitely think
You know, the Choctaw have a word for the mammoth.
they do.
They're like the existence of this animal that wandered around, maintained Blackland prairie environments in Mississippi and ate Osage fruit. They have a name for that animal, and we know what that animal is because of like we have a paleontological name for it, but they already knew that thing existed. It's part of their traditional knowledge base.
Oh, that is wild. Could it have been a
Right?
giant ground sloth?
It could have been, but the way they're describing it, it sounds more like mammoth because we know that like certain fruits are disseminated by mammoth specifically. Like persimmon is another one. Like proboscideans persimmon, it causes them to germinate at a faster rate and things like that.
So would you say then maybe having a motivation to like uncover lost stories as an archaeological motivator for a person would be not appropriate if um
I mean,
they're not
our
ethnically from that area?
no, like our personal motives for doing things and our professional motives for doing things do not have to be the same.
Because like personally motivating, like it's kind of a myth you tell yourself. It's
Mm-hmm.
not really the fact of the world of what the world is. And I think what I see that's really negative out there in terms of uncovering lost stories is just making shit up and literally disregarding the Native American history. And you and I've seen your content, and Scott Wolter, I cannot believe he went to an actual historical mine on Isle Royal, and it has a sign that says it's from the 1870s.
It's like,
He
wow,
made it
look at
on
all
the
this shit that they mined. It must be Phoenicians. It's like, dude, that was done by a bunch of Finns.
Yeah, it's just like that, I think, is uncovering lost stories or something to tell them, like, hey, you're wrong, like, about what we're remembering. This is right because, of this overlooked stuff.
Walter drives me absolutely up the wall. That man just.
I mean, his stuff is not even like, I think Graham Hancock, he makes his stories and interviews sound so much better. Scott Wolter's crap is just bad. And then the Michigan chiseled stone from the UP of Michigan that was never found. I have a friend that shows that the script on that stone was probably found from this book of this.
Yeah, I think I have heard about that.
And it was around at the same time it was forged, and there's a huge history there because a lot of the people were Scandinavian.
Yeah.
And so they
figure.
have these lore, of Vikings and all that stuff, and I think that's definitely detrimental.
It's actually harmful because
the story.
It reaffirms the pervasive belief that American colonialism didn't destroy anything worth talking about. And that's kind of one of the biggest issues, is that because we have erased the indigenous past from public consciousness, people are, with ulterior motives, have a blank slate to insert a counter narrative that says everything that we destroyed didn't matter. They were a bunch
lied to about it.
Yeah, they were a bunch. It's always used as an excuse, and I see this in my comment section all the way down, is these are a bunch of degenerate backward savages, and Europeans showing up and civilizing them was a net positive for them and for the humanity or whatever. Over and over and over and over again. Those are the only kinds of comments that I delete. Everything else I let slide, but those I get rid of.
Wow. I did not know that you curate that out of your, because I definitely see the this, and we've already mentioned this inability to acknowledge any sort of accomplishment or feat or whatever of Native Americans. There always has to be like, no, that might have been influenced by these journeys of these red-haired, light-skinned people that taught them about it. And
I'm going to be hiding those damn red-haired giants for the rest of my career.
Yeah, and then
I've got like 12 of them buried in my backyard. I just keep hiding them.
And like the Smithsonian deliberately has been hiding this stuff, and it's so unbelievable that it really is. And it goes also. This is the communication issue we brought up. Also, we're bringing back full circle, is you cannot communicate effectively enough for people. Some people don't want to be communicated to. It's like the hardest part of science is communicating. That's why we're here. So what were you going to say?
I've only ever, whenever I get they're hiding the red-haired giants thing, I habitually ask, to what end? Help me out here. Why would they be hiding that? And I get one of two responses. One is no response whatsoever. The other, which only one person has ever sacked up and actually told me why he thinks they're doing it, is that the red-haired giants are proof of the Nephilim from the Bible, and the government is trying to hide the fact that the Bible is true.
I wouldn't know about, what about funding? You won't get any funding. Funding.
I think more important, like at the time that the Smithsonian was operating in the early 1900s, when these red-haired giants allegedly all went missing, everyone was hyper-Christian. People at the Smithsonian would be making sure that shit was front and center on every newspaper, proving the Bible was real.
Also, this secret journey. There's a journey between Europe and America before Columbus, early on, like the Phoenicians.
The Phoenicians,
and they had come, and that's been hidden from the public.
Again, to what end? Why?
Yeah, to what end? Like, where's the motivating factor to doing that?
I mean, if anything, there's motivation for that. Like, if that was true, there would be motivation to be really loud about it being true, because it further justifies westward expansion and manifest destiny.
That was a big issue. That was a big part of it, is the manifest destiny, especially settling.
Like, that's why people typically, who are the most ardently supportive of this idea that Europeans were already here, it's always used to say, we have a right to be here. We didn't do anything wrong by committing a continental genocide. It's always ours to begin with.
It's always in a political slant. It's always never, it's not an objective scientific like observation. It's always, and I think this is happening, and this is how it's going to benefit me. And even if it's a very slight thing, so it's strange. And this is all goes into this whole thing of undermining the Native American accomplishment. But I think that's obvious. Like, you and I have seen the regular comments of those type. They're the far gone people. Like, there's no hope. They're like, if there's a bell curve, they're like on the
way over there. Yeah.
But I'm even seeing, the thing I thought was weird is, even in scientifically inclined people, like this ruins versus mounds, like it is so deeply ingrained that in people, even people that want to not be like that, like it just seems like it just maybe there's a lot of politics involved in this, because I'm in geology, so I don't ever really think of the social aspects, like, NAGPRA and all this stuff. When I do interact with the archaeologists at Isle Royal and other things like that, they're always more mindful of, like, the politics of their stuff, where I'm more like, I'm a geochemist and I'm in lakes and no one cares about lakes.
Well,
like,
I mean, we have archaeology specifically has a, long history of showing up, taking whatever we want, and doing a lot of harm, leaving a lot of harm in our wake, and trying to really be aware of that long, violent history that we have, and the extractive, abusive relationship that archaeology has with indigenous communities is part of our education now. Like, we can't pretend to be dispassionate, objective bystanders, because we never have been. We've always been actively operating within a political system that has caused a lot of harm to a lot of people. And learning how to rectify that is part of our training.
That brings up a story for me. When I've been to Belize, and I traveled to some of the Maya sites down there, and one of the earliest archaeologists there found these beautifully pristine, preserved stone pyramids. People, they're important, right? They're stone.
Cultures that matter.
And they're Mayan, Maya. I can't remember when you use, one's for language, one's for sites. But anyway, his first idea was, I wonder what's inside this. Must be gold. Let's blow it up with dynamite. And he blew up with dynamite. And the ruins of the explosion from the dynamite were still evident at these sites. And I was just like, I didn't even really know what to say. I was like, you were that interested in this site, and you came, and this is like, I don't remember, maybe 20s or something, not even like 20s or 30s or something like this. You went all the way to these sites, and you didn't want to preserve it. You thought, hey, I'll just blow it up while I'm here, because maybe inside of it there's like a burial full of jade and gold or something. Or maybe, it was to see what was inside of it is what I remember. And he thought, he didn't have much manpower, so he just would dynamite the side of it off. And you're like, I was just like, what? Are you out of your mind? And then, not to mention the insult that would have been, like, if you were Mayan and you had like known about that site, and this guy's like, hey,
you just blew up the Washington Memorial,
and you just blew it. We could have told you what was inside of it. It's not a creamy nougat of gold in the middle there. It's something else. Or it's just.
One second, I got to throw a couple more coals on this pork shoulder. I'll be right back.
Okay, no problem.
Sorry, I just realized that we've been going for like over an hour, and my temperature has gone below 200.
Thanks for staying with me. We'll like finish up here pretty soon. I have like two other kind of questions I want to know.
Okay, yeah.
You. And I want to stay with that theme where we're talking about. So you said whenever you talk with your friend who's Native American,
Yeah, he's
you
Osage.
learn a lot. Osage. You learn a lot from this person. And so have you, in your professional life or otherwise, worked at all with some Native American communities? And can you talk or speak to that and how that's helped or improved or issues?
The one that I would really like to talk about, I can't yet. That's probably another couple of years out before I can actually like really have that conversation. But just because that work
Okay,
is ongoing. But I can tell a cool story
got it.
about something that like with Kylan, what happened really early on when I first met him. Actually, we were working on this project. We were monitors for a pipeline. Basically, my job was to like be on site while they're doing ground disturbance, so that if something pops up, I'm there to identify what it is and tell them to relocate, whatever. Just making sure that the construction crews are actually like, doing their job and being honest and that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But Kylan was out there as a representative of his own TIPO office, his own Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And so we're just like out in Arkansas wandering around, and mostly he just wanted to talk about like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and shit. But every now and again, he'd want to talk about like some other stuff. So one day he tells me, like, yeah, if we're ever in a spot by a, you know, creek, river, whatever, and there's like a stone cairn, like pile of rocks that are, about yay high and this big and whatever. If it's up on this terrace, it's Osage. But if it's down on that terrace, it's Quapaw. And it was just kind of a, something he was thinking about that he passed on. Well, 2 years later, I was a crew chief on this project in Georgia, and I'm going ahead of my techs and flagging out where I need them to dig and stuff. And I come through this tree line, and there are these big rock piles, nowhere near Osage territory or anything, but the conversation stuck with me. And so I start like mapping in where the rock piles are, and they're all in these linear formations on the slope of a hill. So like, when you're at the edge of agricultural fields and you find big rock piles, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
not this, because it's not the edge of a field. It's on the side of a slope, and it's not like a linear thing where they're making like drainage protections or anything like that. So I decided to record them all as potential human burials, not knowing that indigenous groups in the area had been saying for years, these are burials, don't fuck with them. So I told my supervisors about it, and my boss's boss at the time, her name, she was trying to figure out, well, how do we do a site test for this? Because typically when we do phase one, we're going out and digging and identifying where potential sites are, and then we have to go back for a phase two to do more excavation to identify if that's actually what it was. Traditionally, back in the day, to phase two of this, we would have taken one of them apart to see if there was like a body inside of it. But obviously, we don't want to do that if this actually is a human burial. So she did some looking online and was looking around for like a possible way of dealing with this. And I think she found some sources from Belgium where they used forensic cadaver smelling dogs to identify like possible potential burials. So she floated that idea to, I believe it was the Muskogee in that area. And they're like, yeah, absolutely, let's do that. So they go back, they go in with leaf blowers to get rid of all the surface stuff, and they find way more of them than what I originally identified, because there's like leaf litter all over the place. And so they mapped in all the rest of them. And so then a few years after that, and the cadaver dogs came back with positive hits. They were finding, the dogs were identifying that there were decomposing human remains in and amongst that. I don't know what they're smelling specifically, but they're smelling that there are bones in there. And so then a few years later, I'm at a conference, and both my boss from that project and Kylan were there. And I was able to tell Kylan about, I was working in Georgia. I found these things. It reminded me of what you told me about Osage cairn burials. And we were able to put in place this testing regime to evaluate and demonstrate that, yes, these are likely indigenous burials.
Wow.
And then he tells me, okay, we heard about that and we're starting to implement the cadaver dogs for these kinds of things as like a procedural demonstration that these are what we have been saying they are this whole time. So that entire thing, that loop closed where he told me this story. I put it into practice and it wound up coming back to the Osage as a methodology that they are now using, according to what he has told me about what's happened since.
That's fantastic.
Is it not, though?
That's amazing. I mean, that's directly showing how this incorporating of traditional knowledge is vital to interpreting sites and identifying them.
Those rock piles are all over Georgia, and they are distinct. If you know what landscape features to look for, they're distinguishable from like farmers' field edge rock piles and stuff.
Wow.
We've like departments of transportation have likely been bulldozing them for years because there was no system in place to identify them and no one really took them seriously.
In Kansas, on the tops of the hills in near Kansas State and the Flint Hills, the big prominent hills, there's stacks of rocks up there that are old burials, and you can see them on LiDAR now. And I was helping to map them with a student, but a ton of them have been looted by you know who, so-called scientists back in the day, 1890s and 1900s and stuff. But yeah, so that's amazing story, super cool. And then to finish up, I know you've been with me for a long time, so thank you so much for joining on the first podcast and taking me along on this, or being the person to be on this journey with me. But for if you're a young person watching this and you're like, oh, I might want to do archaeology and I want to maybe do it as a career, what advice would you give that young person?
Like, assuming like they aren't already in, like, they aren't out of college or whatever, like,
yeah, they're like in college, considering college, early bachelors, that I'm thinking 17 to 21.
Sure. Okay. So like the best tools that I was given when I was in undergrad was my professor had a class called Lab Methods where he taught us just really the practical stuff, like here's how to identify stone tools and aspects of the stone tools and the kind of material the stone tool is made of. And then there was a module on, the ceramics and like different surface decorations and in tempering agents. And then we went over animal bones, and then we went over glass and metals and historic period stuff, and just that really foundational practical knowledge that we need. And so few programs have that. You have to ask for it. You have to like actively pursue often like volunteer lab work or maybe work study work within the department to actually get that strong hands-on exposure to all of these different classes of materials, so that when you're in the field, most of your job in the field is not excavating identified sites. Most of the work is finding new sites, like I was describing earlier. It's going through the woods with a shovel and a screen and digging 20 holes a day, screening through it and seeing if there are artifacts. And if you don't know what rocks are artifacts and what rocks aren't artifacts and all the other things, if you can't tell the difference between modern glass and historic glass, then you can't really effectively do your job. You have to learn that stuff. So that's one of the big like practical elements. The other thing that
So you're saying hands-on, be a volunteer to work in a lab if it's an undergrad.
Do whatever you have to do to get your hands on actual artifacts, because that kind of familiarizing yourself with the shapes and the textures and the attributes of these things and how they differ from totally natural stuff is going to serve you more in the long run. I have people who have been in the field for years and still have a poor grasp of some of these fundamentals that I was taught in school. So that's one of them. The other thing is that you have to really understand what it is you're signing up for when you get into archaeology. The attrition rate is really bad, and I think part of it is because people don't really understand what this life is like, right? There is a percentage of archaeologists who, uh, you know, have full-time jobs and, are, going working in a lab during the day and come back home at night and all that other stuff. That's not most of us. I am in the field 11 months out of the year. The other month
Wow.
is going home to see my family for Christmas and Thanksgiving and, whatever vacations I happen to take in between. I am always doing field work. I'm at the way extreme end on that because I like doing field work and I like being in the field. But if you're not mentally prepared for the reality of being on the road and your work circle and your social circle are the same people, and
Hmm.
that's probably about 6 months of your year minimum for the first few years that you're doing this. Because at any point in the last probably 5, 7 years, I could have taken a full-time position and moved to Atlanta or, Denton, Texas or somewhere and gotten a full-time position with a stable company or whatever and
Hmm.
done that. Personally have chosen not to, but that's not really a choice most people have when they're first starting out. You probably got 2 or 3 or more years of road dogging it before you are able to get into that kind of a situation. And also understanding that your position is contractual, right? So when my first job was 3 weeks in South Carolina. And then my next job after that was a week in Virginia, and then with a totally different company. And then I think the next job after that was 3 months in Tennessee. And
Mm.
it's oftentimes like that, where you're just kind of piecing together different jobs with different companies as they come up. And we're in a great position right now because there is a labor surplus or a surplus of work and a labor shortage. So it's not hard to string these jobs together when you're starting out. And a lot of the jobs are going longer than they used to because of infrastructure bills and things like that. Highway developments and
Hmm.
bridge reconstructions and all this other stuff. But understanding when you're getting into it, there is a really abnormal lifestyle aspect to this career field when you're starting out that you got to be ready for, or you're going to have this thing of this isn't what I signed up for. I was lied to. No one told me it was going to be like this. And I think that if you just had reasonable expectations to begin with, it wouldn't be that kind of a problem.
Right,
But
right.
so few people go into the career field, especially the blue collar archaeology career field, not really understanding the nature of the industry.
So maybe in a nutshell, you could say if you want to be an archaeologist, it's a lifestyle and you hope to make a career out of it. And I think a lot of some of the sciences are like that.
It just requires some flexibility. It being able to, pivot and roll and take what, life throws at you and taking the opportunities that are also thrown at you too. I'll get a call. I remember one time I was like, hey, you want to come work with me in Alaska? Yes. Drop whatever
You
job
got
I
to be
was doing
ready.
at the time and went up to Alaska.
You have to be flexible. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, the plus side of archaeology, and I think geology, is you get to travel. So
Yeah.
if that's what you're looking for, that's definitely the field you want to get into as well. And if you like sleeping in hotel rooms, that's another plus side. Some people, I guess, do like that at first.
Our
So
hotel rooms are so home to me now. I've got tapestries that I hang up. I decorate my hotel room when I move into them.
you make it home. Oh my,
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a bunch of cooking equipment that I come home and make real meals with. I don't go out to eat every night. In fact, I very rarely go out to eat. It's Like you've got to make it an actual real life and not this weird, like surreal, uh, like,
It's like you're on tour, but you're instead of going to a show with a
yeah,
bunch of people, you go to the woods and you're
yeah,
with your
exactly.
friends.
Like my musician friends and my archaeology friends, there's a lot of overlap going on with those guys for sure. I actually got one of my musician friends to help with a research project that one of my archaeology friends from grad school is doing on caves and the acoustics of caves. We're going to be presenting that at conference in a couple of weeks here, actually.
That's cool. Teaching my undergrad classes, I've taught in Kansas State and here in Hawaii. One thing, like you mentioned, people don't, their expectations aren't being met with archaeology. The number one problem is young kids coming out of high school, if their parents aren't involved in this, they don't even know that you can be an archaeologist, that you can be a geologist, let alone what they actually would do in a regular job. They have no idea. And when I teach these intro classes, the first thing I started doing was talking about, this is geology. These are kind of careers geologists do. And I would just kind of list like civil engineering, energy, geoarch, water, government, academia, teaching, elementary and high school. And so having expectations, they have no expectations. They literally don't know. They know I can be an accountant, a nurse, a medical doctor, a lawyer, but they
Yeah,
don't think you can actually be a volcanologist, a
yeah.
hydrologist, an archaeologist, a botanist. There are jobs out there for those people. It may be a little harder. You may have to be flexible. You may have to move. You will have to move. It will be a lifestyle that you hope you're going to have a career, but it's a lot easier to make a career out of it than, let's say, the NFL
Yeah,
or becoming
for
a
sure.
professional musician. You can at least have a decent shot of making a life out
The
of
other
it and having a unique life.
the other beauty part of it is, like I said, if I'm working 11 months out of the year, I don't pay rent. I keep my entire paycheck.
Wow, that is a perk. Okay.
Yeah,
We don't see you're on the road so much you don't even have rent.
I have no reason to have an apartment because I am literally on the road 11 months out of the year. And everything else is visiting my family at the holidays.
So you just go back. You need to buy like an ultralight camper and just like get a pickup truck and just be mobile.
Right?
Just just live in like different national parks for a couple of weeks. It's kind of one of my dreams. If I like had a ton of money and a lot of time, I'd buy a nice camper and just live in different parks for a large part of the year. And not even national parks, like the BLM land in the desert.
Yeah.
And like all through that, just like go to remote canyons and just be like, I'm staying here for a couple days. That'd be awesome.
There was a company that I worked for out in the West, and like Western archaeology firms have some really fucky conventional practices, we'll say. We were working out in Wyoming, and we were doing like 8 10-day uh or 10-hour days in a row and then 6 days off. And this was a thing they did so that they could kick us out of the hotels for the 6 days off and not give us a place to stay, which is obviously bullshit. But we're out in, the great American West. So we just took our 6 days off and went to different, like the Grand Tetons, and we went down to Colorado and camped up at 11,000 feet. We went and saw
Wow.
the eclipse in 2017. That's when this was. We went to go see the eclipse in Portland. And I saw one of my friends from high school there that I hadn't seen in probably 10 years at that point. And just like it was definitely a really shitty thing for this company and many companies like it out there to do to their entire employment staff. But, we were all out there coming from Tennessee, Carolina and such. And we're like, we're making the best of this, because otherwise we probably would have just like slacked around in our hotel and not actually gone to see anything.
When you're from the East Coast and you grow up in the East Coast, and the first time, maybe, I don't know if that was your first time, but the first time I was like in Colorado doing field work in Utah, I was like, when I like got out of my hotel, I was like, I cannot believe, like, mountains with snow on them and
In
like
June.
uh yeah, and elk and like those red sandstones in the desert looked like movie sets, and like
Yeah.
the canyons, and I was like, I would have been with you. Like,
It's
here,
a it's a it's a cool experience that everyone should do a few times. I've got some techs right now that they're pretty fresh out of school and they've only so far worked for us. And I'm like, y'all need to go work for some other people real quick. Like go fuck off to New Mexico or something for a little bit.
nice, man. Well, it was great having you on my first podcast, and I wish you the best of luck with your channel. Whenever you have a new upload, I always make sure to click and watch a little bit of it or all of it. Maybe one day we'll cross paths at a meeting someday.
Oh, good talking to you.
Yeah, my career now has gone more into hardcore paleoclimate research.
Cool.
So I'm not overlapping as much in the GeoArc world, but I still am going to meetings, and maybe one day we will see each other.
Hey, you should come out to SAA. You should come out to SAA. There, it's going to be in Colorado this year.
Maybe we have our email, so let me know. Keep me in the loop, and if I have a chance, I'll get out there.
Cool.
All right, talk to you again. Bye.
Peace.